Plato devotes some of his Atlantis writings to the plants and animals of the fabled land. He mentions many general types of plants and animals found in Atlantis, but only identifies two by name, pulse and elephants. Pre-conquest Mesoamerica fills in the blanks Plato left behind, including pulse and elephants. Plato said Atlantis was blessed with a rich soil that grew a wide variety of abundant produce. Throughout the discovery and conquest of Mexico, Bernal Diaz del Castillo commented on Mesoamerican farms and the large volume of crops they produced. He was impressed by the wide variety of crops the Aztecs grew, and lists dozens of fruits and vegetables grown in pre-conquest Mexico. Corn, yam, a half-dozen variety of beans, including kidney, lima, navy, and pinto, as well as cocoa, vanilla, pineapple, tomato, bell pepper, a dozen varieties of squash, including pumpkin and zucchini, many varieties of chili pepper, peanuts, avocado, and papaya. These are some of the unique American fruits and vegetables 16th century Spanish conquistadors saw for the first time in pre-conquest Mexico that are familiar to us in the modern world. Pre-conquest Mexico was blessed with a rich soil that grew a wide variety of abundant produce, just like Atlantis. Plato said Atlantis had large plantations. Throughout pre-conquest Mexico, large tracts of land were set aside for farming. Those large agricultural plots, some of which were fed by irrigation, were often referred to as plantations by Bernal Diaz del Castillo. Yet again, Aztec Mexico is a match for Plato's Atlantis. It's not surprising the Spanish conquistadors witnessed sprawling plantations while traveling through the Mexican countryside. The Aztec Empire fed a population that was 10 to 20 times larger than 16th century Spain and Portugal combined, in an area roughly the same size as Spain and Portugal. Utilizing vast plantations, the Aztecs produced ample food for a large population in a small country, and that's a testament to the fertility of the American soil, just as Plato said for Atlantis. Plato said the city of Atlantis and surrounding countryside were provided with everything they needed. The same can be said for Tenochtitlan and the other cities scattered in the mountains and along the shores of the lakes in the Valley of Mexico. Food was plentiful. The conquistadors were well fed throughout the conquest. They never mentioned the Aztecs lacking food, starving, or begging for food in pre-conquest Mexico prior to the final siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521. Likewise, the Spanish never mentioned homelessness amongst the Aztecs. The conquistadors also said the Aztecs were well dressed. There was no want for clothing. By all accounts of the Spanish conquistadors, the Aztecs were provided with everything they needed, just like Atlantis. Plato said Atlantis contained an adequate supply of timber for building purposes. The bountiful plenty of pre-conquest Mexico included an adequate source of trees for building and woodcrafting. The Tlatelolco marketplace in Tenochtitlan had a bustling timber and lumber trade. Although a majority of buildings in pre-conquest Aztec Mexico were constructed from various components of earth, milled lumber was used in buildings and structures throughout the region as well. In pre-conquest Mexico, The most notable use of timber for building purposes was for making canoes and the many wooden bridges spanning the causeways, roads, and canals of Tenochtitlan. When Cortes and his men reached the city of Iztapalapa, they were lodged in royal accommodations. The conquistadors noted their quarters had beams of cedar, and the rooms were finely decorated with sweet scented wood furnishings. Plato said Atlantis was home to a variety of wild and domesticated animals that lived in a variety of ecosystems. Like Atlantis, Tenochtitlan and the Valley of Mexico were home to abundant wildlife living in diverse habitats. The Valley of Mexico is located on a high plain. Plato said there were animals of the plain in Atlantis. The pre-conquest Valley of Mexico was home to swamps and marshes. Plato tells us there were swamp and marsh animals in Atlantis. The pre-conquest lakes in the Valley of Mexico were fed by rivers. Plato tells us there were river animals in Atlantis. The Aztecs raised a variety of domestic and food animals. Plato tells us that Atlantis was home to domesticated and food animals. Combined, 16th century Spanish conquistadors and modern historians note some 3 dozen wild and domestic animal species living in the Valley of Mexico at the time of the Spanish conquest. The diversity of animals in the Valley of Mexico and the diversity of their habitats provide another important geographic clue linking Atlantis to Tenochtitlan and the pre-conquest Valley of Mexico. Plato clearly stated there were elephants in Atlantis. The Spanish conquistadors tell us nothing about elephants in pre-conquest Mexico. They never recorded seeing any elephants when they arrived in America, and that's because there were no elephants in America at the time of the European discovery. However, the archaeological record in and around southern Mexico suggests the Aztec, the Maya, and their predecessors were familiar with the elephant just as Plato said about Atlantis. The people of Mesoamerica left images of elephants in their cultural artifacts for us in the modern world to ponder. The elephant images of pre-conquest Mesoamerica suggests the people of Mexico and Central America saw living elephants at some point in time during the existence of their civilization. Even stranger, the paleontology record shows that mammoths and mastodons, close relatives of the modern elephant, once roamed the North American continent, including Mesoamerica. And, strangest of all, mammoths and mastodons went extinct on the American continent approximately 12,000 years ago, 8,500 years before the rise of civilization in Mesoamerica. The appearance of elephants in the archaeological record of Mesoamerica creates a problem suggesting several things. First, it suggests the American elephant didn't go extinct 12,000 years ago. It survived into the late Bronze Age, where it was seen by Native Americans living in a civilization that dates no further back than 2000 BC. Secondly, it suggests the civilizations of Mexico and Central America are at least 12,000 years old and were around at the accepted time of the American elephant's demise. Lastly, it suggests the civilizations of Mesoamerica had cross-oceanic contact with Africa, Southeast Asia, or India, home of modern elephants, and that contact occurred long before the arrival of Cortes and the Spanish. However, the most bizarre twist in the mystery of Mesoamerican elephants comes from the pen of Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo. While traveling through Mexico, the Aztecs presented Cortes with many gifts. One of those gifts was an enormous bone. Bernal Diaz del Castillo said the Aztecs presented Cortes with a leg bone that was very thick and the height of a man. Then the Aztecs brought more bones to Cortes. The second delivery was like the first, but the bones were eroded by the soil. The Aztecs told Cortes the bones belonged to giants that roamed the earth in the past. Cortes then ordered the bones to be shipped back to Spain so the king could see them. And, as Bernal Diaz del Castillo dutifully recorded, the bones were shipped to Spain. What happened to the bones after that is unknown. The Spanish conquistador never described the bones as stone-like or heavy, which would indicate a petrified state, and possibly belonging to a dinosaur, mastodon, or mammoth. He said some of the large bones showed signs of decay, describing them as eroded and eaten by the soil. That suggests bones of an animal that died in more recent times. At the time of the Spanish conquest, there were no large animals living in Mesoamerica that had bones the size described by Bernal Diaz del Castillo. Are the bones described by a 16th century conquistador those of an elephant that may have died sometime during the existence of civilization in Mexico? The answer lies somewhere in Spain, the bones in question having arrived there several years before the fall of the Aztec Empire. Representations of elephants are frequently encountered in the archaeological record of Mesoamerica. They show up in art and architecture, on pottery, rocks, statues, trinkets, buildings, and bones. The best explanation for the elephant images in Mesoamerica is that the people of pre-conquest Mexico and Central America saw elephants as they lived and breathed with their very own eyes, just like Atlantis. The strange elephant paradox of Mesoamerica is one more link in a long chain of evidence suggesting Tenochtitlan and Mexico are indeed Plato's Atlantis. Plato said Atlantis produced aromatic substances. There were roots and herbs for eating. It also produced bushes, flowers, and fruits that exuded gum. Cereals, pulse, and fruit from trees were cultivated, and all those things were produced abundantly. Once again, we have a match for Atlantis in Aztec Mexico. The first of the unique American plants alluded to by Plato are the roots. These include root vegetables such as yam and cassava, as well as peanuts. Herbs for eating were commonly grown in pre-conquest Mexico. The Spanish conquistadors often mentioned them growing on the rooftops of homes in Tenochtitlan. Mesoamerican herbs, including tobacco, were commonly used for medicinal purposes in pre-conquest as well as post-conquest Mexico. In 1570, King Philip II of Spain sent his personal physician, Francisco Hernandez, to Mexico. Hernandez spent 7 years collecting information about the medicinal herbs and plants of what was once Aztec Mexico. At the end of his tour in the New World, the physician returned to Spain, having cataloged over 1,200 medicinal herbs and plants used in Native American medical treatments. That's an abundance of herbs, just as Plato said about Atlantis. Gum is another product of Atlantis that was produced in pre-conquest Mexico. Gum from pre-conquest Mexico came in three forms. One is chewing gum. If you've ever chewed a piece of gum, you've done something that originated in pre-conquest Mexico. The latex-based chewing gum was extracted from the Mexican and Central American sapodilla tree. It was chewy and flavorful. The second gum from pre-conquest Mexico was called copal. It was a resinous, gum-like substance that exuded from a tree. It was fragrant and made into incense. The third gum from pre-conquest Mexico is rubber. The substance most commonly associated with automobile tires originated in Mesoamerica. Rubber, formed into balls, was part of the tax tribute paid to the Aztec Empire by its southern provinces. Rubber balls were used in the ball court games of both the Aztecs and Maya. Plato said Atlantis grew cereal crops, but failed to list which ones. The cereal crops are oats, barley, rye, wheat, rice, and corn. According to the conquistadors, Corn and rice were the cereal crops grown by the Mesoamerican civilizations of Mexico and Central America. Plato said pulse was grown in Atlantis. Pulse is the edible seeds of peas, beans, lentils, and similar plants having pods. When it comes to beans, pre-conquest Mexico was the undisputed champion. Most of the beans found in today's markets have their origins in America. Bernardino de Sahagún, a post-conquest chronicler of the Aztecs, was impressed by the variety of foods the post-conquest Native Americans made. When listing the ingredients found in the native dishes, Sahagún specifically mentions pulse. Aztec fruits were often mentioned by the conquistadors and the Spanish chroniclers who came to Mexico after the conquest. The pre-conquest Aztec fruits most often named are the pineapple, the zapote, plums, grapes, and something only mentioned as a fruit with a sharp taste not unlike cherries, possibly a reference to a small tomato. Plato gave generous praise to Atlantis for its ability to grow abundant and useful plants in a favorable climate, just like Mesoamerica. Plato said the spring supplying water to the city of Atlantis flowed into a grove with a rich soil. The grove of Poseidon, as Plato called it, was full of gardens and trees that were beautiful and tall. We in the modern world would call the Grove of Poseidon a park or a botanical garden. It was land set aside for leisure enjoyment, a place to relax and unwind on a sunny afternoon. With the exception of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, land set aside in this manner for amusement and pleasure is unheard of in the ancient Western world of the 5th century BC. What appears to be a small and insignificant fact about Atlantis is in fact a key clue for determining the true identity and real-world location of the legendary lost city. To find something as unique as the Grove of Poseidon in pre-conquest Mexico is to find Atlantis. So, what do the Spanish conquistadors have to say about spring-fed groves and gardens in pre-conquest Mexico? Plenty. The Valley of Mexico was full of them. The Spaniards were astounded by the size, beauty, and meticulous care given to the parks of the major cities in the Valley of Mexico. Some Aztec parks were comparable in size to New York City's Central Park and San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. The conquistadors were smitten by the Aztec parks, and it reflects in their descriptions of them. Their awe for the parks of Mexico is almost childlike, naive and innocent, full of giddy joy and wonder at the sight of such a novelty. The conquistadors gave high praise to the park in Tenochtitlan, Montezuma's personal playground. Plato's praise for the Grove of Poseidon is echoed 1900 years later by Bernal Diaz del Castillo when he had this to say about Tenochtitlan's Grove of Mexico. Quote, "We went to the orchard and garden, which was such a wonderful thing to see and walk in that I was never tired of looking at the diversity of the trees and noting the scent which each one had, and the paths full of roses and flowers, and the many fruit trees, and the pond of fresh water. There was another thing to observe, that great canoes were able to pass into the garden from the lake through an opening that had been made so that there was no need for the occupants to land, and all was cemented and very splendid with many kinds of stones with pictures on them, which gave much to think about. Then the birds of many kinds and breeds which came into the pond. I say again that I stood looking at it and thought that never in the world would there be discovered other lands such as these." Unquote. Cortez also praised Montezuma's Grove of Mexico. In a letter to King Charles V of Spain, the conquistador wrote, quote, "Montezuma had a magnificent garden, and in it there rose belvederes made of marble, floored with exquisitely worked jasper. There were 10 lakes there, where there were kept all the many and varied kinds of water birds that live in that country. From time to time, these lakes were emptied for cleaning, and then they were refilled by means of the canals. And I assure your majesty that the fish-eating birds alone were given 10 arrobas a day. 300 men took care of these birds and did nothing else. There were corridors and places for watching above each of these lakes, where Montezuma would stand to amuse himself by looking at them." Unquote. The water that flowed into Montezuma's garden parkland came from the mainland springs that supplied Tenochtitlan with fresh water, just like Atlantis. The Grove of Poseidon was a unique landmark that very few, if any, Western cities of antiquity possessed. The pre-conquest Valley of Mexico contained many groves of Poseidon or groves of Mexico. When compared to the Grove of Poseidon, not only do the multi-acre groves and gardens of pre-conquest Mexico match Plato's criteria, they far exceed it. The conclusion is unavoidable. The search for Atlantis is over.